Welcome to the News Hour. NATO has held an emergency meeting on the crisis in Afghanistan, saying lessons must be learnt about the speed that the Taliban took over the country. Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg said that he knew the risks in pulling out troops, but didn't expect the government to fall so quickly, leaving people desperate to leave the country.
The eyes of the world are on Afghanistan. We expect the Taliban to uphold their commitments and ensure that Afghanistan does not again become a safe haven for international terrorism. The Taliban must put an end to violence around the country and uphold the fundamental rights of all Afghan citizens, men, women and children.
Taliban members have been seen alongside civilians for the first Friday prayers since the armed group took control of Afghanistan. The Taliban issued guidance to imams across the country, saying they should use the sermons to appeal for unity. People in Kabul reported seeing more worshippers than usual, and no dress code restrictions were enforced. Afghans trying to flee the country are facing several obstacles, including Taliban roadblocks and problems with paperwork. The chaos at Kabul airport has continued on Friday, despite US and NATO pledges to accelerate the evacuations. Well, we have two correspondents looking at this story for us this hour. In a moment, we'll speak to Jonah Hull in our London broadcast centre, who's following developments with NATO. But first, let's cross over to Kabul, where Rob McBride is standing by. And Rob, really chaotic scenes at the airport, 24 hours ago. Things haven't really changed much, have they?
It does remain pretty volatile, pretty chaotic. In fact, Stoltenberg, in his news statement there, spoke about the need to continue with this evacuation and pick up the speed of the evacuation, the importance of it for the NATO allies. But yes, it does remain extremely chaotic. The US is very much in control of the airport and of the terminal building and of the operating area, leaving the Taliban on the outside of the terminal and also at times setting up roadblocks on the airport road leading to the terminal just to try to keep down the numbers of people heading there. It is ordered people who don't have paperwork, who shouldn't be there, to go back home. That doesn't seem to have been heeded by that many people. There are also concerns that as it sets up this roadblocks, although it has given a guarantee of safe passage for people who believe they may be targeted or there may be reprisals for having worked with foreign forces in the past, that the Taliban is actually looking out for maybe some high-worth individuals, high-target individuals for reprisals. So that is certainly the concern of people trying to head to the airport, but they remain chaotic scenes. Meanwhile, the Civil Aviation Authority is looking at just when they might be able to lay on commercial flights again. You've got to remember, it's last Sunday since somebody could buy a ticket, go to the airport and check in and get a seat on a passenger plane out of Kabul. Since then, it's just been these evacuation flights and special charters. Now, the Civil Aviation Authority has said that they want to restart commercial flights, but it's all dependent, they say, on if the US, who have occupied and control the terminal, will let them do so. And as this evacuation continues, that does look unlikely. And when you consider that the US is now talking about potentially going beyond the 31st of August deadline for US forces to be finally leaving Afghanistan, it does lead to the possibility that there might not be commercial flights until after the end of this month. We simply don't know.
So let's talk about what happened on Friday. Friday prayers across the Islamic world normally, and of course the Islamic world's attention and the global attention, of course, on Kabul's mosques.
That's right. Well, the prayers went ahead and they were relatively uneventful. There were concerns that possibly the Taliban was going to have a high-profile presence, may have been on the doors of mosques insisting that people adhere to a strict dress code. That wasn't the case. But the Taliban has urged imams to pass on the message that people should really be looking for unity. They should not flee the country. They should pass on that message. And also to correct what the Taliban calls a negative propaganda, whatever that means. So it looks as though the Taliban does recognise the importance of imams in trying to allay the fears of the population. I mean, something else which is worth pointing out that has been happening this Friday outside of Kabul is potentially some resistance, armed resistance to the Taliban. And if the perpetrators of this would have you believe, this is the start of the fight back, although it remains to be seen just how serious this is. This is the country's defence minister, General Bismillah Mohammadi. Now, it has to be said he's still claiming to be the defence minister by default because the Taliban hasn't chanced to appoint his successor yet, their own defence minister. So he's more like the former defence minister. But there has been some fighting in the province of Baghlan. That's to the north of Kabul, and claims by this resistance movement led by this former defence minister that they've taken 3 districts and that the province of Baghlan will soon be captured. It's a bold claim, but Baghlan is close, interestingly, to the Panjshir Valley. Now, the Panjshir Valley is traditionally the hotbed of resistance to the Taliban. It was during the 1990s. It was where the Northern Alliance, that was their stronghold, and where the 2001 fight back, supported by the Americans, took place from. So this, according to the General Bismillah Mohammadi, is the start of the fight back by his forces. It remains to be seen, though, just how far this might go, or whether it could indicate that once again Afghanistan could be in for a phase of a long, simmering, low-intensity conflict, of which it has been used to now for decades.
Rob McBride in Kabul for us. Thanks very much for the update. Let's cross over to Jonah Hull in London, who's been monitoring what Jens Stoltenberg has had to say. He's the Secretary-General of NATO. We heard some quotes at the top of this news hour. Jonah, what were the take-home moments?
Jens Stoltenberg billed this meeting. Remember, there was a meeting earlier in the week on Tuesday. Billed this as an ongoing a sort of show of close coordination by NATO allies, looking at the events in Afghanistan, and an attempt, and there'll be many others, I suspect, to forge a common approach towards what happens next. The priority, very clearly, from Mr. Stoltenberg's comments remains the evacuation, as Rob was describing there. 18,000 people have been taken out so far since Sunday. But the job is far from done. NATO has 800 of its own civilian personnel still on the ground. The Dutch foreign minister, during the course of this meeting, said people didn't know, countries didn't know whose citizens were on which planes coming out of Kabul. Such was the ongoing chaos there. But, you know, inevitably, when they meet, these foreign ministers, conversation must, I think, turn to events afterwards. Morale would be pretty low, you'd have to assume, among these ministers, European allies who went along with the US decision to withdraw because they felt they simply didn't have the strength to stay without the US, but who feel that it was the wrong decision carried out in the wrong way. They've got to now figure out what to do next. They've got to look at the security situation. They've got to look at the possibility now that reprisals will start taking place by the Taliban against people who worked for NATO countries and NATO missions. There's evidence that that is already happening. They've got to start thinking about levers of influence that they can possibly try to exert on the Taliban to keep them, to rein them in, to keep them from sort of reverting to type. Mr. Stoltenberg keeps talking about the gains over the last 20 years and doing whatever they can to try and preserve those gains. So you're talking about things like development aid. I mean, there's not really an awful lot they can do, but I think the chief thing that they can wrestle with, must wrestle with, is whether to recognise this group. And Mr. Stoltenberg said diplomatic recognition has to be conditioned on how they behave and how they live up to their commitments. And those commitments he outlined as setting up an inclusive government, including women and minorities, protecting human rights, the rule of law, and making sure the country doesn't again become a haven for terrorists. In the end, NATO can say these things, but it's now patently obvious that there's really very little they can do to actively influence these events on the ground.
Indeed, another important meeting that was going on with Afghanistan, as top of the agenda, I'm sure, was a meeting between Vladimir Putin of Russia hosting Angela Merkel in the final few weeks of her chancellorship of Germany before national elections there. Of course, Afghanistan top of the list for both countries and for very different reasons.
For very different reasons. I mean, Afghanistan drives, if you like, yet another wedge into relations between Russia and Germany, Putin and Merkel. Merkel is on her way out at the end of next month. This is a sort of farewell visit. They've disagreed over the years on a great many things. 16 years she's been in power. He's been around a bit longer and will be quite a lot longer yet. Other things will be on the agenda, not least the imprisonment of the anti-Putin critic Alexei Navalny and, of course, events in Ukraine and Belarus. But yes, Afghanistan will be there. It'll be part of it. The reality is And it is a deeply uncomfortable reality for NATO allies like Germany that they can no longer influence events, but Russia and China certainly can. They maintain their presence inside Afghanistan. They maintain contacts with the Taliban, and to the extent that Afghanistan is discussed at the table between these two, they'll be looking for, or Merkel perhaps will be looking for, some basis of cooperation, some reason to see shared interests in cooperating in Afghanistan in order to try and get Russia to influence the Taliban again, to rein them in, to prevent them from reverting to type, to try desperately to retain some of the advances of the last 20 years, not least, of course, rights for women and girls, minorities, and so on.
Jonah Hull in London, thanks very much for the update. Well, in around 20 minutes' time at 15:30 GMT, I'll be speaking to NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg about the situation in Afghanistan here on the News Hour. Now, German broadcaster Deutsche Welle says a family member of one of its journalists was shot dead during a house search. Rights groups are urging governments to step up efforts to evacuate and protect journalists in the country. The Committee to Protect Journalists is warning that women are particularly at risk, and it says that the Taliban took power. Two prominent female journalists have been barred from their jobs, and they document the homes of media workers raided and others attacked while covering recent protests in Jalalabad. While Stephen Butler is a programme coordinator at the Committee to Protect Journalists, he says many journalists are being targeted by the Taliban and those trying to leave are struggling.
The Taliban spokesman 2 days ago said that they were going to respect the free and independent press under laid down conditions. And we've seen the very prominent news program on Tolo News that's continuing to operate. Including sending out their women reporters and having women newscasters. But on the streets, it can be a very different story. It's not clear that the Taliban militants who are on the streets in Kabul or elsewhere around the country are getting that message, and they seem to have a law unto themselves, and so they are attacking journalists and beating journalists. And of course, we know that certain journalists are being sought out by the Taliban. Their homes have been searched. We know of one case where a journalist was actually in the house at the time. He ran out the back when the Taliban arrived, and they fired after him. He managed to get away. Other journalists have received phone threats. A very prominent woman journalist was told, your time is up, and she's gone into hiding. We've been trying to get her out. So far unsuccessfully. She has not been able to get through these barriers.
Facebook, Twitter and LinkedIn have tightened security across their platforms to protect users in Afghanistan. Facebook has added a tool allowing them to lock down their profiles with a single click. Now, people who aren't friends won't be able to see their timelines or photos, and Twitter says it's working with partners to fast-track requests to remove archived tweets. Members of the Afghan girls' robotics team have been rescued and brought to Qatar. The team of around a dozen was formed in 2017 in the western province of Herat. They made headlines that year when they couldn't get visas for a competition in Washington. And until then, President Donald Trump intervened. They've since been involved in events around the world. In a statement sent to Al Jazeera, the team that helped the girls reach safety said it's deeply grateful to Qatar for its support, which included expediting the visa process and sending a plane after flights from Afghanistan were cancelled. Roya Mahbub is the founder of the Digital Citizen Fund, which oversees the Afghan robotics team. She says she's grateful the girls are able to continue competitions during this tense time.
It's a very challenging time, and I understand that many people are scared and they are freaking out about what's going on, and they are running to feeling that they have to leave the country. We are really thankful and grateful that when we reach out to the Qatar governments, they give us a warm welcome, and they provide their logistic help to getting the girls to the safety. Right now they are in Doha to continue their competitions because there are World Championship of the robotics called First Global, and unfortunately because of uncertainty and the conflict in Herat and Kabul, they couldn't continue. So there was a pause on their competitions, and right now they are in Doha and they are determined to complete the competitions. I believe that Afghanistan children have a vision of their countries that's probably different than how the world see. And I believe that the next generation of the Afghan entrepreneur and scientists is unlimited potential that education and connectivity can offer them.
Well, still ahead here on the Al Jazeera News Hour. An attack on northern Burkina Faso kills dozens of people as violence escalates in West Africa's Sahel region. Also, the illegal trade that's endangering